Namibia has implemented quite a number of policies aimed at addressing rural challenges, and these policies continue to evolve. For instance, if we look at Vision 2030, through Vision 2030, the country actually aspires to build a knowledge-based, industrialized economy by 2030. It's an ambitious goal, as I indicated earlier. But part of it is also focused on rural development. In fact, the NDPs, which are the implementing tool of the Vision 2030, most of them had a theme of rural development and poverty alleviation. We also have decentralization policy. As we know, decentralization policy was aimed at bringing services closer to communities, but also then to ensure community participation in matters affecting them, also related to economic development matters in rural areas. However, I think where we are, we can agree that the decentralization that we envisage to have by now, we may not have achieved, at least not to the extent that was desired. Then we have the National Rural Development Policy and Strategy. As I said, these are evolving. I think the latest one that we have was for 2012. It was developed in 2012. It's being reviewed now, and our hope is that as we go about reviewing what is happening currently in Namibia, that some of those things will then see themselves through the policy and the strategy for rural development that we are going to develop. So we have looked at what has happened so far. Also in terms of policies, what is it that we are seeing? We think there is actually a need for us to enhance the effectiveness of some of the provisions that we have in the rural development policies. For instance, the issue of coordination. Many stakeholders are involved. Many stakeholders are involved in rural development activities. Excuse me. So many stakeholders are involved. What we have seen so far is there hasn't been clear coordination between these stakeholders. And when you have people operating in silos, it actually causes issues. So then, what we also then have seen is that in the rural development policy and rural development strategy, the current one that we have that are being reviewed, we may not have looked at region-specific challenges. So we have taken an approach of one size fits all. But as we know, regions are heterogeneous. So there is no one size fits all. So hopefully we can then take that on. And then what we also think should happen is we need to incorporate region-specific analysis into the design of the new policy and strategy that we are reviewing now. And there is also a case for us to have a consistent story in terms of identifying the main constraints, not in rural areas as a whole. We need to look at specific regions and say, in this specific region, these are the constraints, otherwise we are going to miss it. And then we need also then to incorporate detailed analysis of which policy interventions are more suited to decentralized processes and why. That's on the policy. If we now look at what are some of the activities that we are seeing happening in rural areas, we picked up actually that there are 3 key activities that are taking place in rural areas. The 3 are wholesale and retail trade. We know there is a lot of pambashes, a lot of small shops and so on in rural areas. And then we have the agriculture sector. This has been playing a role not only in rural areas but also at national level. And then we have the fishing and forestry and accommodation and food services. So agriculture, fishing and forestry has always remained a key sector, especially in the rural economy. But also the accommodation and services, food services and beverages is picking up somehow. That's what we have realized in the 3rd place. However, most of those activities that are taking place in terms of businesses, they are not registered. About 78% of those businesses are not registered. And that in itself says it all in terms of, do they then have access to the formal, do they have access to formal services and support that they need to get? I've spoken about the agricultural sector. The only aspect that I didn't mention is in terms of employment, for instance. The main key employment activity or employment creating sector in rural areas is actually the agricultural sector, and you can see the numbers that we are projecting there. In terms of tourism, of recent we have seen a number of not only accommodation and food services, but also conservancies have become a key tourist activities in rural areas. We have picked up that a total of 86 communal conservancies and 42 communal forests are registered by the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism. So one of the main challenges when it comes to conservancies, for instance, in the tourism industry in rural areas is that the regional councils, for instance, they are either not involved or they actually don't understand what this whole rural tourism activity is supposed to be. I think there is a case for us to do more in terms of involving them so that they are then able to maybe encourage communities to engage in more of those activities and so on. Then there's small-scale mining. This is mostly happening in the Erongo, Kunene, and Karas region. So the small-scale miners, in our view, is one sector that can also create employment in the rural areas and contribute to the development of rural areas. The next item that we looked at, aspect that we looked at, is infrastructure and accessibility to infrastructure. Because as previous speakers have indicated, infrastructure is actually an enabler to economic development. And if economic activities are to take place or happen in rural areas, we need to ensure that there are infrastructures. So we have looked at the aspect of energy, for instance. In terms of energy, we have seen that the access rate currently is estimated at 48%, and that 48% is made up of 73% in urban areas and 21% in rural areas. You can already see the divide there. The one aspect when it comes to energy is cost. It's not always affordable to the rural populations. It's more expensive. And in fact, with the exception of South Africa, if you look at the neighboring countries, Namibia is actually the second highest. Then if you look at telecommunications, let me just, I think I've gone very far. If you look at telecommunications, for instance, and internet access, I don't know what is happening here now. My sincerest apology. Something seems to be happening. But if you look at, I will be continuing as it comes. If you look at telecommunications and internet access, for instance, generally we have a high coverage rate in terms of telecommunications. However, the cost aspect is again a challenge, especially when it comes to rural economies or rural populations. They are not able to afford the cost of data, for instance. And we have identified 3 regions where this is mainly an issue in terms of access, for instance. Kavango West is one, and then you have Omaheke, and Kunene. Especially those 3 regions, there is actually an issue when it comes to telecommunications and internet access. Then we looked at
Don't press now.
Okay. Then we looked at land tenure as an aspect as well. But I need this. Something is not working. Okay, I will be talking. Maybe somebody, yeah. Then we look at land tenure system, for instance, which is also posing a challenge for rural development. Access to land plays a big role in economic development, and it is supposed to be an enabler to access to finance, and also in terms of improving infrastructure by communities themselves. You need land. So the land tenure system currently in Namibia is a constraint in that the rights, land rights that you have, you cannot make use of it as collateral, for instance, for you to access finance. So we are also, in terms of infrastructure for access to finance, we think maybe things like agent banking, if we can make use of approaches like agent banking to expand financial inclusion by bringing banking services closer to a larger portion of the population. I don't think it is, I will go wrong if I were to mention, for instance, that one of the things that we have identified that can assist us in terms of access to finance is actually on the payments front. where we are supposed to be looking at what are some of the systems that we can implement as a country to enhance access to finance, especially in terms of payment-related infrastructure and so on. And I know that it was in the newspapers, for instance, in the media, that the Bank of Namibia has been working on trying to develop a system that will ensure access to finance through a payment system-related approach. I think those are some of the things that we are supposed to be implementing. Then, in terms of roads, we said infrastructure are key, and part of the important infrastructure is actually roads, access to roads. So what we have seen is that we have identified the issue of earth roads, and that are mainly prevalent in the rural areas. So if you can look at the highlighted in yellow, for instance, for the 5th consecutive year, maybe before I go to the highlighted in yellow, for the 5th consecutive year, Namibia has been identified as the top in terms of the quality of roads. I don't know what is happening. Yeah, maybe I should. So it has been identified as top in terms of the quality of roads. However, despite that ranking, the quality of roads on a national level has much to be desired, especially in rural areas. So the rural earth roads that are characterizing the rural areas have deficiencies in terms of quality. And because of the quality aspect that is lacking, you make it actually difficult for rural economies to access markets, to connect with other areas and so on.